It was 1:43 a.m. on July 30th, 2025, and the quiet night sky over Ukraine erupted in chaos. 8 Russian missiles tore through the air, aimed directly at civilian targets. The world watched in disbelief as cities crumbled, lives were lost, and the balance of power was shaken. But what followed next would change the course of the war. Ukraine, with nothing but raw ingenuity and determination, would strike back, against all odds. This is the story of how a surprise attack became a devastating counter-offensive. At 1:43 a.m. on July 30th, 2025, the stillness of the Ukrainian night was shattered. The peaceful horizon, once calm and serene, suddenly ignited in flames. Russian missiles, 8 in total, rocketed toward the heart of Ukrainian territory with terrifying precision. The initial explosion was deafening, followed by a thunderous series of impacts. Buildings crumbled, smoke billowed into the night sky, and sirens echoed through the air. The targets were civilian locations, schools, hospitals, and residential areas, places that had no defense against such an assault. The immediate toll was catastrophic. 32 innocent lives were lost in a heartbeat, and 14 others were left seriously injured. A school, a church, and a medical center were obliterated. In that one terrifying moment, Ukraine's sense of safety vanished. But beyond the destruction, there was something else. A chilling message from Russia, aimed not just at military strength, but at the very spirit of the Ukrainian people. This wasn't a typical military strike. This was a calculated act of terror designed to break morale, to target the civilians and crush any hope of peace. But Ukraine would soon show that the spirit of its people could not be extinguished so easily. The retaliation was coming, and it would be swift, unexpected, and fierce. The destruction from the missile strike was immediate and severe, but it wasn't just the physical damage that left Ukraine reeling. It was the emotional toll. Cities once filled with life were now ghost towns, shattered by the devastation. The people of Ukraine, who had already endured years of conflict, were now faced with the unimaginable: the brutal targeting of civilians. This wasn't an isolated military strike, it was an assault on their very way of life. The government, still reeling from the suddenness of the attack, scrambled to assess the damage. President Volodymyr Zelensky, informed of the scale of the destruction, gathered his inner circle for an emergency meeting. The room was heavy with silence as they reviewed the intel. The images were heart-wrenching, the damage unfathomable. But in those dark moments, there was a shift in the air. Zelensky, after a long pause, stood up. "They think we are weak. Let us show them what desperation can do," he said, his voice resolute. The plan was clear. No high-tech missiles, no stealth bombers, just the strength of their ingenuity and willpower. Ukraine's response would come from an unlikely source. They would not fight with money, they would fight with resourcefulness. The morning after the attack, as the smoke still lingered in the skies over Ukraine, the sense of loss was palpable. But in the heart of the Ukrainian government, something else was brewing. The devastation of the night before had ignited a fire within the leadership, a fire that would not burn out easily. It was clear to President Zelensky and his military advisors that Ukraine could not afford to respond with the weapons Russia expected. There would be no barrage of missiles, no flashy airstrikes. They had neither the resources nor the time to waste on such conventional methods. Instead, the strategy was born from necessity. Ukraine would fight back not with advanced technology, but with raw ingenuity. They would tap into their most valuable resource, their people's resilience and determination. The plan that emerged was audacious and humble at the same time. An unconventional, scrappy response that defied logic, but held the power to change the course of the conflict. Within 72 hours, Ukraine had gathered 270 homemade UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles, built from scavenged parts, commercial drone motors, old dash cameras, recycled GPS modules, and explosives repurposed from unexploded artillery shells. These UAVs weren't high-tech marvels, they were crude but effective weapons. Wrapped in aluminum foil to hide from radar, equipped with off-the-shelf flight software, and built for speed rather than precision, these drones would be Ukraine's counterattack. In this desperate yet brilliant move, Ukraine was turning weakness into strength. Their target? A symbol of Russia's military might, the Sochi oil depot, an essential refueling hub for the Russian forces near the southern front. The mission was clear: strike deep into Russian territory, hurt them where it would hurt the most, and send a message that would echo far beyond the battlefield. As the drones prepared for launch, the sense of anticipation was electric. The world was about to witness an entirely new form of warfare, one that relied not on expensive arsenals, but on creativity and sheer will.
The clock ticked closer to 3:10 a.m. on August 2nd, 2025. In Sochi, Russia, the city slept under the quiet glow of security floodlights, oblivious to the storm that was about to descend upon it. A few hundred miles to the west, in Ukraine, the homemade UAVs were prepared, their small frames lined up, ready for their mission. These drones, pieced together in basements and garages, were about to become weapons of war. They may have been crude, but they were now the most dangerous thing in the skies. At precisely 3:10 a.m., the first wave of 270 Ukrainian drones crossed into Russian airspace. Unlike the sleek, high-tech drones of the West, these UAVs didn't come with stealth bombers or fighter jets to escort them. They came alone, slipping under radar coverage, flying low, and avoiding the electronic defenses that Russia had spent millions to develop. It was a tactic that no one expected, least of all the Russian military. The drones weren't just following a flight path, they were on a mission of vengeance. The target was Sochi's strategic oil depot, a critical hub for Russian military fuel supplies. The depot housed over 1.4 million barrels of refined diesel and tank fuel. A direct hit here could trigger a chain reaction of devastating explosions. And that's exactly what happened. As the first UAV slammed into fuel tank 14C, the resulting explosion was catastrophic. The fireball that erupted from the tank could be seen miles away, lighting up the Black Sea coastline as if the sky itself had burst into flames. Seconds later, the second and third waves of drones struck, targeting fuel trucks, pumping stations, and storage yards. The depot was engulfed in chaos. Vehicles exploded, sending massive shockwaves through the air. T-90 Russian tanks, once proud symbols of military power, were reduced to twisted, burning hulks of metal. Russian soldiers scrambled to contain the fires, but the drones kept coming. For 7 minutes, the assault continued, each drone doing its job, each explosion shaking the very foundations of the Russian military. The Russian response was slow, disorganized, and completely unprepared for such a relentless attack. By 3:19 a.m., the depot had fallen silent, a smoldering ruin where once stood one of Russia's most vital supply points. Ukraine's audacious move had sent shockwaves across the region. Not only had they struck back, they had humiliated Russia in the process. What had begun as a desperate act of retaliation had turned into an overwhelming display of defiance, one that would force Russia to reassess its entire military strategy. By dawn, the scale of destruction at the Sochi oil depot was undeniable. Satellite images from U.S. reconnaissance satellites confirmed what the world had feared. 60% of the depot was gone, a combination of burning fuel tanks, destroyed military vehicles, and shattered infrastructure. The fireballs that had erupted into the sky were visible from space, and the damage to Russian military logistics was immediate and severe. The shockwaves from the attack reverberated through the Russian military command. Senior officers scrambled to account for the devastation, but the damage was already done. The Russian Southern Command found itself paralyzed. Tactical refueling operations in the region were halted indefinitely. Convoys that had relied on the depot for fuel were rerouted, causing massive delays. Russian soldiers, once confident in their defensive capabilities, now faced a logistical nightmare. But beyond the immediate military impact, the psychological effect of the attack was profound. The myth of Russia's invulnerability began to crack. Sochi, a city once considered a safe zone, had become a symbol of overconfidence, and that illusion was shattered in a matter of minutes. For Ukraine, the attack was more than just a victory. It was a powerful statement. The underdog had struck back, showing the world that even without advanced technology, resilience and resourcefulness could still win the day. As the smoke from the ruined Sochi oil depot billowed into the sky, the world began to take notice. News outlets across the globe broke the story, and financial markets reacted swiftly. The destruction of the oil depot sent shockwaves through the global energy sector. Oil prices surged by nearly 8%, the highest one-day spike since the 2022 Middle Eastern refinery bombings.
traders in London and New York scrambled to respond, knowing full well the long-term impact of Ukraine's strike on Russia's fuel supply. Behind the scenes, intelligence agencies began to piece together what had happened. The world had just witnessed an entirely new form of warfare, one that relied on ingenuity and grassroots innovation rather than high-tech missiles and billion-dollar fighter jets. Military analysts were left in disbelief, trying to understand how 170 homemade UAVs, constructed from off-the-shelf components and recycled explosives, could cause so much damage to one of Russia's most critical military hubs.
Russia, for its part, was unusually quiet. State media reported minimal damage and no immediate casualty figures were released. The Kremlin's silence spoke volumes. Behind the scenes, Russian officials knew they had been humiliated, and the attack was something they had not anticipated. A low-cost, high-impact response that sent a clear message to the world. In Ukraine, the response to the strike on Sochi was electric. While the rest of the world marveled at the audacity of the attack, for Ukrainians, it represented something far more personal. A victory that transcended the battlefield. The underdog had struck, and the victory was theirs. The Ukrainian people, battered by years of war and suffering, found a renewed sense of pride and strength in the attack. President Zelensky, in a rare public address, delivered a message of defiance and resilience. "They may have tried to break us," he said, his voice firm, "but we are not broken. We will stand and we will fight, not with missiles, but with our will to survive." The words resonated deeply with the Ukrainian population, who saw in this moment not just a military success, but a symbol of their resolve. In the streets of Kyiv, people celebrated, not just for the destruction of a Russian military target, but for the restoration of hope. The homemade drones, crafted from scrap parts and ingenuity, had proven that even in the face of overwhelming odds, a determined nation could rise up. The world watched as Ukraine, once seen as powerless, now stood tall as a symbol of asymmetric warfare. The message was clear: Ukraine would not back down. In Russia, the attack on the Sochi oil depot was more than just a military defeat. It was a humiliation that shook the foundations of Russian military pride. The damage to the depot and the disruption to their southern command sent shockwaves through the Kremlin. Russia's once untouchable status was now questioned, not only by Ukraine, but by the rest of the world. For the first time in this conflict, Russia faced a reminder that no territory was truly out of reach. Military officials scrambled to secure their fuel and ammunition stockpiles, moving them to more secure underground locations, a process expected to take over a week. This move would cause further delays in supplying troops and tanks on the southern front, crippling their operations and leaving them vulnerable. Publicly, Russia maintained its usual rhetoric, minimizing the significance of the strike and claiming it as an isolated incident. However, behind closed doors, the tension was palpable. Russia's military leadership knew the full scope of the damage, both physical and psychological. For the first time in years, the Kremlin had to confront a stark reality. Ukraine's resourcefulness had caught them off guard, and their vulnerability was now exposed. The balance of power had shifted, and Russia would have to rethink its strategy in the face of Ukraine's newfound resolve. The attack on the Sochi oil depot marked a pivotal moment in the conflict. Not only had Ukraine struck a crushing blow to Russian logistics, but it had also redefined modern warfare. The world witnessed firsthand how low-cost, homemade technology could challenge the most advanced military systems. The UAVs, built from commercial drone parts, dash cameras, and recycled explosives, had leveled a multi-billion-dollar fuel depot, creating a new precedent for asymmetric warfare. Military analysts began to reassess their views on technological superiority. The attack made it clear, warfare is no longer solely defined by expensive missiles and advanced fighter jets. The Ukrainian drones, though simple in design, had exploited weaknesses in Russian defenses, showing that even the most sophisticated systems could be bypassed with enough creativity and willpower. Globally, this shift in strategy did not go unnoticed. Military strategists across NATO and beyond began to take a hard look at their own arsenals, questioning whether their reliance on traditional weaponry was still a reliable form of defense. Ukraine's ingenuity had forced them to rethink the cost-effectiveness of modern warfare. In Ukraine, the impact was just as profound. The message was clear. Despite their lack of resources, Ukraine had proven that resilience and innovation could turn the tide. The battle was far from over, but now Ukraine had the world's attention. As the dust settled over Sochi, the world was left in stunned silence. Ukraine's audacious strike had not only inflicted serious damage to Russia's military infrastructure, but had also sent a resounding message across the globe. The rules of modern warfare had changed. The traditional reliance on high-tech, multi-billion-dollar weaponry was no longer the only path to victory. Instead,
ingenuity, resourcefulness, and determination had proven that even the most technologically advanced military could be vulnerable to an unconventional attack. For Ukraine, this was more than a tactical win. It was a victory of the spirit. The homemade drones, assembled from everyday components, had achieved what many thought impossible. With these simple, low-cost devices, Ukraine had shifted the balance of power, showing the world that when a nation fights for its survival, nothing is truly out of reach. International military observers began to reassess the value of non-traditional warfare. The success of Ukraine's drones forced governments and defense contractors to rethink their strategies, understanding that innovation could come from the most unexpected places. This moment would go down in history as a turning point not just in the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, but in the broader landscape of modern warfare. Ukraine had demonstrated that, in this new age, creativity might just be the most powerful weapon of all.